Well, hello there and welcome to this discussion for Canberra Guided Tours. I'm Joe Prevedello and with me is the proprietor of Canberra Guided Tours and tour guide extraordinaire, Neil Hermes.
Oh, Joe, you're boosting me up far too much, far too much.
So in this particular discussion, we're going to talk about one of the quintessential locations for any tourist, for any visitor to Canberra, and that is Australia's current Parliament House.
Yep, fantastic.
Some people call it New Parliament House. Officially, it's just Parliament House or Australian Parliament House, but it's the centre of Australia's democratic process, the home of the National Parliament, and a fantastic place to visit whenever anybody comes to Canberra as the national capital, whether they be international or Australian visitors.
Absolutely. No, it's a highlight of a tour into Canberra, and all Australians need to visit Parliament House because it is, as you say, it's the heart of our democracy. But we all see the shots on the telly, on the news of our parliamentarians in Parliament House. To go through the building and to get a sense of how it operates gives people a real insight, not just to the Parliament building itself, but to the way in which our whole parliamentary system works in Australia. It's a fabulous place to visit. Absolutely amazing.
It is, and it's just a real gem on the highlights tour. I guess before we go into the history of the building, why it came about, how it came about, we'll just flag at this point that in this discussion, we'll talk not only about the building itself and a little bit about the importance of it, what it does, but you and I have both been fortunate enough in our careers so far to have this building as part of other parts of our life in government relations roles or
yes, that's right.
public service roles
yes.
That we've been in. So whenever you or I would conduct a tour of Parliament House, we can actually bring a unique perspective to the building for visitors that your regular tour guide wouldn't be able to give.
Well, not only have you and I both in other parts of our lives worked in this building, but we also have very close friends. In fact, I have family members who also work in the building. So to bring that sort of real life experience to the building really does help people understand, not only the mechanics of how it works, the spectacular nature of the building. It's a wonderful building just in terms of the physical presence of the building, but also its importance in how the building and the Parliament actually does affect and how that translates to all Australians. So it's a must-do experience for all Australians visiting it and getting that sort of insight on a tour, particularly on a tour. I think you can often visit places such as Parliament House and wander through, but unless you have someone who's giving you a particular insight, you're probably missing out on a lot.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning here. Let's start with how Parliament House, this magnificent building, home of Australia's democracy, came about.
Okay.
Let's go back to the early 1970s in Canberra.
Okay, so Australian Parliament House from 1901 was in Melbourne. They moved Parliament House to our old building in 1927, and that building was always meant to be a temporary building. It was built during the just prior to the Depression, at a time when Canberra was starting to grow, and they wanted to move the Parliament from Melbourne to its permanent home. But they didn't plan to build a permanent building at that stage. So what had happened is from 1927 through to the 1970s is Parliament sat in a building which was fine at the beginning, but very quickly became absolutely too small for the sorts of parliamentary processes that we now expect to happen. And not only too small, but the technology's changed. In our old Parliament House, for example, there was no radio broadcasts from the Parliament to begin with. There was never any TV broadcasts from the old building.
Is that the case? Never any TV?
Never any TV. So basically by the 70s it was decided we needed a new building. And the Parliament that we have now, that site was selected. It was selected on a prominent point in the triangle within the ACT, within Canberra's layout, and the site was selected on the hill, Capitol Hill, And it was Malcolm Fraser who made the decision that we would actually build the building. By the time it was built and open for the bicentennial in 1988, Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at that time, and we then had a building that was one large enough to accommodate the sort of parliament that we needed into the 21st century.
Yes, because let's remember, from Federation in 1901 to the point where new Parliament House opened in 1988, the size of the Parliament, the physical number of parliamentarians actually doubled.
It did, yes. I mean, we had 6 senators from each state in the original building. We now have 12. We had half the number of House of Reps representatives. The House of Reps representatives in the old building didn't have an office each. Their desk was their seat in the Parliament chamber. So the building, the old Parliament House building was just too small, which is why we then needed this much, much larger building that could accommodate the modern technologies, the physical space. And it was really, it was visionary that we, as a country and our political leaders at the time, decided to actually build this building and to have it of the size and the presence that it has. It really is one of those decisions that all Australians should be proud of, that we have this facility for our parliament. And so in 1988 it opened. It was designed by an Italian who was living in New York at the time,
Romaldo Gurgler.
Gurgler. He came to Canberra in the 80s to build the building, and then he remained in Canberra and in fact became an Australian, and in fact only died a couple of years ago in Canberra. So he was here to see this magnificent building built, and it was, as I said, it was opened in 1988. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at the time. The building was opened by the Queen, and it really does have a powerful presence.
So let's talk about the conceptual design. You can see the front of the building on the screen next to us here. It's quite a grand building, but in terms of parliament buildings around the world, it really stands out. It's a very postmodern design building, but there's actually an inherent concept behind why the way it looks. It was built into Capitol Hill.
Yes,
for a very special conceptual reason.
Absolutely, and it goes to the whole design of the building. Gurgler wanted the building to be a building for the people. He wanted it to be not a building for the politicians. He wanted it to be a building for Australians. So one of the great features which you're alluding to is that a hill was decided as the location, but in building the building, we didn't have a great structure that went up towering above the rest of the city with us all approaching the building and looking up to the Parliament. What they did was they cut the hill away, built the building into the hill, and then covered it. And in fact, it has grass across the top. And very symbolically, but importantly, Australians can walk across the top of the building and look down into the building, effectively looking down on their politicians, not up to them.
Well, that's it. The concept is that the people are always above the government.
Always above the government. And that's built into the building. And furthermore, the internal structure of the building, Gurgler has designed it in such a way as that we can enter a large percent, as the public, as average Australians, walk, or people from overseas, and particularly from people from overseas, to see how democracy, we believe, should be run. We can enter the building and go virtually right into the building and into the centre of the building and go into the chambers. We can watch the Parliament in action. We can go into the Great Hall. The building is very open internally, which means that not only can we walk on top, but we can walk in through large parts of the building inside as well. Now, there's been concessions having to be made to security, in more recent years, but it's still a very public building, and that's one of the great features of our Parliament. It's not a building that you can walk up to a gate and look in through a peephole. It's a closed system. And it goes to the heart of how our democracy works. We expect to be able to watch our politicians, see how they vote, not have them vote into a box, secretly. We can physically all be there and watch them voting. So that's all built into the design of the building.
Yeah.
So
it's a good point you make, and an important democratic value that we have, I guess. Not to offend anybody from from Greece, but I can remember being in Athens, the home of democracy. Greece, the ancient Greeks developed the concept, and going up to the National Parliament there in Athens, no one from the public is allowed near the building.
No, and look, it's not just a Greek thing; it happens all around the world, and it's a credit to us as Australians that we built our original Parliament House in that style. We built our new Parliament House in that style, and that's how we expect our democracy to be. But there's another element of the design of the building which is really powerful for people. Not only is it open, not only can we visit much of it, but Gergler also decided to make to make the building feel Australian.
Yes,
internally.
So wherever you go in the building, I mean, there's a reason behind everything in there, and there's a reason. All the little quirky things in there are as they are, and they're all very much there because of some Australian purpose.
Exactly, and not only has Australian materials been largely used everywhere in the building.
Timber,
all the timbers, the Australian finishes on everything. Not only do we have that, but it's done in a way to make you feel like it's Australia. So when you walk into through those front doors that you can see in the picture behind us, you walk into that building, you have not just walked into Versailles, you have not just walked into the Hampton Court, you've walked into an Australian building, and it has a very Australian feel about it, and that's how it's been designed. So that gives me and gives many Australians a real sense of pride when you go into that building that it is something that speaks to people about being Australian, not about just being some magnificent building that's gold leaf everywhere.
That's right. So, for example, the marble foyer, which is that main entrance hall behind those doors, is supposed to represent the Daintree rainforest of far north Queensland with its tall marble columns representing the tall timber in the forest.
Yeah, exactly. And when that's pointed out to people, that's the sense you get. And you haven't gone into a gold leaf sort of 18th century French castle or palace. You've gone into an Australian setting, and that's where anyone from a visiting head of state will first see the building. To mum and dad on one of our tours, mum and dad from some part of Australia coming with us on one of our tours. It's the first impression you get as well. So that sense is shared, irrespective of why you're visiting the building, from a head of state to anybody else.
That's right. Now, when the two most important, I guess, rooms in the building are the two houses of the Parliament, the House of Representatives, the lower house, and then the upper house, the Senate. And our system of government in Australia is a constitutional monarchy, and it's based broadly on the English system, but takes some elements of the American system. But even the chambers themselves and the colour schemes incorporate an Australiana, don't they?
They sure do. And you mentioned the American and the British system. Of course, we took some elements from the French democracy as well. So we were lucky in 1901 or prior to 1901 that we could invent a scheme.
Try to pick the
best bits that we could from around the world. We were lucky in that way, and that we were lucky that we had people who were able to see to measure up those benefits. But you're right. The building, those two main rooms in the building, the two chambers, have a very Australian feel. But not only an Australian feel, not only are they coloured in an Australian way, but the important thing is that in each of those galleries there's 3 public galleries that you can sit in and watch the Parliament. So it's very public, those chambers, which is a very Australian thing. And not only that, we have in this particular building, we have special places where school children can visit those chambers and be in the chamber, right up in the ceiling, looking down into the Parliament, looking down on the politicians from behind glass, so they can make as much noise as they like, but be watching Parliament in action. So that's been designed into the experience. So even from school kids on an excursion to Canberra can see the Parliament working as part of that design. And of course, the other element that both of the chambers have is a very large press gallery. So we have the press there watching, we have the cameras watching, we have the radio watching. So they're very public spaces, but very Australian spaces as well.
I would recommend, if people are considering visiting Parliament House with Canberra Guided Tours, to come, if they can, on a parliamentary sitting day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because it's a very different experience to just going at a non-sitting time. There's a real buzz and a real hive of activity in the building.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly question time in the House of Representatives is the must-see show in Canberra when it's sitting. And it's easy to get in. It's not hard for us to incorporate that into a tour on a day if it's a sitting day. Sitting days are Tuesday, Wednesdays and Thursdays, and there's about 14 weeks of a year, which is a sitting week. So, you know, the chances of people being here on those days is when the question time is happening is high. I would just say from a tourism point of view, though, Joe, some people do find it a little difficult to be here on those days because the cost of accommodation in Canberra goes up quite a lot on those days. So you have to watch your budget if you want to be here when Parliament is sitting, because sometimes it's harder to get a hotel room if you're staying in a hotel in the city on sitting days, because it's such a busy time for the whole city. But nevertheless, for Australians who know the politicians, who know all the players, who see them on TV and the news every night, to be able to sit there and look down on them as they're engaged in a vibrant question time is a fabulous experience.
I mean, for us, I guess, being who we are and the different careers that we have outside of tourism, we can often take for granted what it's like being in that building. But when you are taking clients around and showing them things in the building, particularly on a sitting day, they get a real thrill out of it.
They do.
It's amazing. They are just in awe of what's
absolutely
happening around them. They'll see the Prime Minister or the Treasurer walk past.
Absolutely. And Joe, one of the things that happens too during question time, if you're lucky enough to be here at those times, is that sure, we can watch it on the Parliament on the TV, or we can listen to it on the radio and it's reported. But people don't realise, of course, that what's reported on the TV is what's being spoken to in the microphone that's in front of the person speaking. But when you're in the chamber, you realise that there's 100 people speaking all at the same time.
That's not the only thing being said.
That's not the only thing being said. And it's a real theatre that's going on. And so you hear this excitement and buzz as people might say slightly derogatory things about one another across the chamber about some matter. And it's a real colourful time.
Yeah.
So it puts a whole new perspective on how the sort of visceral part of the Parliament operates. And yes, as you say, to sit there and be able to see the Prime Minister, the opposition leader, the key colourful players that you know, or perhaps the member from your local electorate it really does give people a buzz. It's fantastic.
So let's now talk about the operational side of the building and more what we know, not as tour guides, not pointing out the various features of the building, the architectural things, things like that, talking about the system of government. Let's talk about the things that we know, the things that you and I can actually bring to a tour that others wouldn't have the privilege of knowing or experiencing, and the things that we can relay to people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you go first. I mean, you've got some stories about this building that...
it's I guess I'm lucky that I've had the ability to have several jobs in this building, one being a tour guide, one essentially being a lobbyist, working as a ministerial staffer for one of the ministers in the building, and also for a brief time working in the press gallery as a journalist. So I guess I've just about covered all bases apart from working in the staff cafeteria.
Well, you have. And I haven't had that wider experience, but I have worked in various roles within the building. And yeah, and there's all sorts of elements to the stories that you can share with people on tour. I mean, for example, one of the big events that occurs in the building, which often gets talked about, is the Midwinter Ball. And of course, one of the great features of this building is we have this magnificent facility in the middle of the building, which is where major functions occur, called the Great Hall. And it has wonderful design features which you really have to be in the building to see and to experience. But that building is public in the sense that all sorts of public events happen within it. And one of the events of the year that happens in that big hall is you'll get 1,000 or more people at the Midsummer Ball. Now that event's not public; it's a by invitation event for politicians and the media.
So the American equivalent would be like the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Exactly. And, of course, the stories that come out of that event every year are amazing. And, they get talked about around the...
Plenty of gossip.
Yeah, plenty of gossip. And, that just gives, if you can share some of the things that you hear about those sort of stories, which, are probably just gossip, let's say. But it does give a feeling for how the building works and how the interaction between the public, the media, the politicians, the public servants, how that internal stress within the building actually produces the democracy that we see.
But I mean, you can relay experiences. I mean, you've been a senior public servant, a senior government official. And, you would have many, many times walked to the minister's office and sat down with the minister and the minister's senior advisors in their office.
Yep, that's right.
To discuss the high-powered issues about whatever.
Yeah, about the day, yes.
About budgets, about public perception.
Yep.
And I must say, and it's not a hubris thing here, but when you work in that ministerial wing, which is actually at the back, on the southern side.
Looking
of the
at that
building.
Photograph behind us, Joe, it's on the other side of the building.
That's right, on the other side of the building. It often hit me, and when you would be working in there, thinking some incredible decisions for this country, the big major decisions are being made within a 50-metre radius of where I'm sitting at my desk at the moment.
Sure.
In all of these various ministerial offices. You're talking about government approvals, you're talking about appropriations for funding programs.
Yeah.
The really big government decisions, they're taking place in that small set of offices at the back of the building.
And we can walk through the building, not through those offices, but we can walk through the building and get an insight for how all that process works. And yes, some of us who live in Canberra do take for granted those processes. And one of the wonderful things that I like doing when we're on tour for people from all around Australia is to help them work out how their local member interacts in that space and how their local representatives are how they actually deliver. And it's one of the really lovely things is when people ask questions about how things work, because you can then help them understand, what the processes. The building is fabulous, but the processes within it can be a bit opaque to people. And we can give people an insight. But when you're there, you can get a better understanding of how it works, especially if you happen to brush shoulders with a politician who happens to be going into the cafeteria at the same time as the tour group does, or, as you say, during question time when we can actually see them. So it brings to life the purpose for which Canberra was built, why we have a national capital, why we have a parliament, and how our democracy works. And it's not dull and technical. It's vibrant and colourful.
Oh, it is.
And we can make a lot of fun as we do a tour through the building.
Well, I mean, some of the experiences I've had in that building have been unbelievable. I can remember when I started out as a radio journalist and I was working for one of the Sydney radio stations, and we got word that there was going to be a leadership challenge from the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to challenge the current Prime Minister Julia Gillard. This was back in 2013, and it actually happened that Kevin Rudd won the Prime Ministership back that day, and the energy in the building, running around, going to the various doorstop press conferences. It was like a carnival atmosphere in the building. I mean, it was a real theatre. It was a very serious aspect to it.
Yeah, a carnival and a theatre that actually has real life consequences.
Huge ramifications
for all Australians. That's right.
Just incredible. I can remember another occasion. I was up there actually for a job interview in a minister's office, and the advisor who was interviewing me for a particular job took me into the minister's office. He said, "Look, we better meet at 2 p.m, given that's question time. The minister will be out of the office. It'll be a little bit calmer. They'll be down in the chamber, and we'll be able to go into the minister's office and have a good, quiet chat." And it just so happened that on that particular day, a group of unruly protesters glued their hands to the railings in the public gallery in the House of Representatives, and Parliament was actually suspended. The building went into a state of chaos.
Yep.
And the minister and a bunch of advisors came back to the office, and I was thrust into the middle of this whole situation going on. I didn't get the job in that minister's office, but I could tell you it was just unbelievable.
Well, I mean, you're a little younger than I am, Joe, and so your stories go back to Kevin Rudd, but some of my stories can go back as far as experiences I had working with Malcolm Fraser, and then many prime ministers since then. So, but I think the point you're making and the general point of this discussion is to point out that this is not just concrete and grass and ponds in front of it. This building not only has
it lives and breathes.
It not only has a physical presence and a whole design presence, but it also has. As you say, it's a living and breathing place, and to bring that to to give people an insight into a sort of a look into those processes is a wonderful thing to be able to do. And I mean, one of the things is that when Parliament is sitting, there's 3,000 people. It's a small town.
It is.
It has shops.
It has its own post office.
Post office and all the rest of it. So it's a large group of people. It's a small town in its own right, but it's also vital in terms of the national consequences nationally. And for a visitor, I mean, all Australians should at least once in their lives, as adults, go through where they can appreciate, that at a high level. I know many children go through it as part of their education programs, and that's great. But I think all Australians as adults should go through the Parliament, particularly in a guided way, so that they get an idea and a sense of what this building means to all of us and how important it is and how proud they can be of the building.
Yeah, so like many aspects of the Highlights Tour, really in Parliament House is something for everyone. If you're into the political theatre, it's got it in spades.
Yep.
If you're into the architecture, and you want to learn things like the fact that there's 500-year-old Tasmanian hue and pine built into the panels in the Prime Minister's office.
Yep.
You can learn that. If you want to learn about the more administrative aspects of the building, you can do that. You could literally go on for so long there and learn so much. But I think Canberra Guided Tours gives a really good overview in the hour and a half to 2 hours that you spend there on a regular tour.
On our regular tour, our Highlights Tour, we spend a couple of hours in Parliament House. We usually have lunch there in the Queen's Terrace, and it does give people that insight to why the building is important, why it's important for all Australians.
It really is a must-visit attraction.
Absolutely must.
On the Canberra Guided Tours Highlights Tour. Neil, thank you for being part of this discussion.
Thanks very much, Joe.